Welcome
to
Art 101
with Mr.
Burgher.
Hey friends, welcome back to another episode of Art 101 with me, Mr. Burgher. If you like this video and you like this series, please make sure you like, share, and subscribe. Today, I'm going to work with a buddy of mine, Andy Golightly, and we're going to talk a little bit about Jackson Pollock. One of the most troubled artists of the abstract expressionistic movement, a field of artists filled with trouble, is the gestural abstraction artist, or action painter, Jackson Pollock. Before we dive too deeply into the life of Pollock, maybe we should first look at what abstraction is and how it applies to an artist, which is precisely where my colleague, Andy Golightly, comes into this conversation.
Hi, I'm Andy Golightly, and I am a practicing artist who works in abstract expressionism. Most people would relate my stuff to a lot of color field.
Were you listening to the dude's story, Donnie?
Walter?
Were you listening to the dude's story?
I was bowling.
So you have no frame of reference here, Donnie.
Gestural abstraction's been around a long time. Andy, why don't you get us started with this?
Let's look at the context of it. Abstract expressionism seeks visual content from within the artist rather than from out in the natural world.
Modern artist, it seems to me, is working and expressing an inner world.
I want to express my feelings rather than illustrate them. Technique is just a means of arriving at a statement.
The modern artist is living in a mechanical age. And we have mechanical means of representing objects in nature, such as the camera and the photograph.
Just because you can't compare it to something that you're actually looking at doesn't mean you can't easily put, I know it's called non-objective art, meaning it really, non-objective to me really means non-representational.
Some may be shocked to learn that gestural abstraction was used as a Cold War weapon with the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. The Soviet Union incorporated a style known as socialist realism. This style was intended to depict and glorify common workers' struggle towards socialist progress.
We see what's called socialist realism, which is really just another name for communist art that tries to uplift the worker. And what's interesting is really American regionalism does the same thing, so that's one of the reasons why the art world made such a huge shift from this stylized representation of life, because it was kind of like this controlled way of people thinking about their own culture, and the Soviets used this art to model how they wanted their culture to be.
The grunt worker was convinced, through various means including the arts, that work for the country was the most admirable work around. The visual style was known as tractor art, was realistically rendered so people could clearly understand the intent of the artwork. The everyday person became the subject of the novel, the play, the poetry, the rousing music, and the visual art. Painters would depict happy, muscular peasants and workers in factories and collective farms.
See, this is what I'm talking about.
In the United States, the Central Intelligence Agency, known as the CIA, would develop the Congress of Cultural Freedom in 1950. The intent of the CCF was to counter the socialist realism style in literature, philosophy, music, and visual art. Now you're asking yourself, why in the world would they do that? To remove the idea that the work of the common laborer was meaningful. Under the CCF, the CIA hosted 150 exhibits in Paris, France in 1952. In those exhibits, the art of Jackson Pollock, Mark Rothko, Robert Motherwell, William de Kooning, and others, was used to promote the abstraction as the most internationally accepted visual art being made in the day. It took some help in promoting by Nelson Rockefeller and John Whitney from the Museum of Modern Art in New York to pull this off. The end result was successful, and the United States was able to counter Soviet socialist realism. He was born as far away from the art world as most could ever imagine. He was the youngest of 5 boys, born to Stella and Leroy Pollock in Cody, Wyoming.
He actually only lived in Wyoming for the first 18 months of his life. He wanted this cowboy persona. I mean, he walked around New York with cowboy boots playing a harmonica so that people would think he was a cowboy.
I think Jackson had a sense of the outdoors and loved nature in a general sort of sentimental fashion, romantic fashion, I should say. But he never participated in things that men in the West did. He was coddled. It was part of his problem. His ploy was to go around the Manhattan like a cowboy, hinting of his cowboy past. When he first arrived, I thought he was the most beguiling physically of any of the Pollock boys, with a flashing smile, which I later learned was a ploy of his as he manipulated people. But in the beginning, I was ingratiated by him. But gradually, I soured on Jackson because I saw he was exploitative, manipulative, selfish, and lazy.
Soon the young family was moving on to Arizona and then California. His first real art experience was at the Manual Arts High School in Los Angeles, California, where Pollock would end up being expelled for fighting. His oldest brother, Charles, would go out to New York City to study at the Art Students League. Jackson would soon follow.
In New York, I spent 2 years at the Art Students League with Tom Benton. He was a strong personality to react against.
Now, Benton was an American mural painter that was very respected. His cartoon-like paintings of the everyday Midwestern life were his calling card. He first got into art as a cartoonist in Joplin, Missouri, went on to be formally trained at the Art Institute of Chicago, went on to Academy in Paris, France, and brought all of those skills with him as an artist and educator in New York City. The times were evolving, and here's what Benton thought about the evolution of time that he was living in.
You can't categorically say, as was held for a time in the 19th century, that the great artist is the historical painter, and that the genre painter is a lesser artist, and the landscape painter is still a lesser artist, and the still life painter lesser than that, and the decorator of pots still less. Of course, that would put the abstract expressions on the very bottom of the line. But you can't hold those views absolutely at all times.
Eventually, he would move from New York to live in Kansas City, where he would pass away in 1975, literally with a paintbrush in his hand. The style of Benton and Pollock were as far apart as you could get, but I think it's safe to say that Pollock would learn composition, if nothing else, from Thomas Hart Benton.
While he was a drunk a-hole sometimes, other times he knew how to schmooze people. Jackson would not, later in his life, he would not give Benton really any credit for his training, which I don't know how fair or unfair that is. I know that one of the things that he definitely took from Benton was just the size of canvases. Benton would work in a mural sizes, and Pollock was really impressed with the Mexican murals at the time that like Diego Rivera would create, just because of the sheer size, just standing in front of something that big.
He was also greatly influenced by the work of the Cubist and Surrealist styles. While studying under Benton, Pollock would also get work for the easel division of the Works Progress Administration's Federal Arts Project for nearly 8 years. Not long after beginning his studies in New York, he would be invited to participate in the French and American Painting Show in 1942. Through his involvement in this show, he would meet his future wife, Lee Krasner.
Hoffman, in his teaching, independent of how abstract exactly you worked stayed very closely with the image outside, whether it was the model or the still life. You had to adhere, absolutely. You could reduce it to a vertical and horizontal measurement of space if you wanted to. He wouldn't object there, but you had to adhere to what was there in front of you. Well, when he came up to Pollock's place, his response was, very talented, join my class, you work by heart, this is no good, you will repeat yourself. Pollock said, I am nature, whereas Hoffman was saying nature is out there, I am observing nature. That was the real big break.
Art collector, dealer, and patron of several artists, Peggy Guggenheim saw the potential in the budding artist. She offered him his first solo exhibition in 1943 at her relatively new Art of This Century gallery and would pay him $150 a month for the year's work in exchange for any works that did not sell in that show. This was a partnership that was maintained for several years. Along with her patronage through shows and money, she also commissioned him for a huge mural, smartly titled Mural. It was a huge commission with a huge size, 8 feet tall and nearly 24 feet long.
I think he needed to paint big later on because he didn't want to start with the shape of the format of the canvas, as Cézanne had taught us all to do. He felt on, you can see that every paint stroke in the mature Cézanne is more or less echoes the format, the rectangularity. And so Pollock wanted to get free of that, so when he'd spread a canvas on the floor, as he took to doing, he didn't want to have that damn rectangle in his field of vision so soon. It was as though he wanted to find his way to it.
He was worried and thought a lot about what he was going to paint, and Peggy was starting to get a little bit restless about the work not showing up. There is a story that over the course of one night he painted the entire work, with the finished product launching Pollock from a complete unknown to being the hottest artist in the world. There is also a story that, not knowing exactly how to start the project, he began by writing his name across the entire canvas and then began to fill in the blanks. Not only did this give him a start of some fame, but this would also alter his approach to painting forever after. This was the pivot point from which he would angle away from figurative surrealism and move in the direction of action-oriented gestural abstraction.
I think it's clear to see that the key players, Peggy Guggenheim, who gave him his first show, Clement Greenberg, who wrote all of those articles and blasted how great he was, and Lee Krasner, who stuck by him and hounded and found while he was in the barn painting, she was looking for shows.
Without her guidance and support, where would he have been? I think he would have been dead in the gutter somewhere.
My God, and you're drunk. You're drunk. Are you drunk?
No.
No.
What do I know? I color for a living, but I do know that without Lee Krasner, there would be no Jackson Pollock. Lee Krasner was an artist, but focused much of her energy on the first year that she was with Jackson Pollock to really help promote and manage his work. Struggling with alcoholism since he was 15 years old, Pollock would go in and out of psychoanalysis during his adulthood to help him recover from binges. It is said that when he was being professionally analyzed, his work was fantastic, but most of the time he got bitter, overworked, got stressed out, went out to get a drink, and would have to be found or would eventually drag himself home after days of binge drinking. He had too many distractions and opportunities to do bad things in the city. After their marriage on October the 25th, 1945, Pollock and Krasner would move to a small farm at 830 Fireplace Road in the Springs on East Hampton, Long Island in New York State in October of 45. On the farm, he was able to have space by cleaning out an old barn that he repurposed into his studio. Lee would work out of the house that was more climate controlled, and originally the barn had no electricity, no heat, and had no insulation. But as time passed, he would upgrade that facility into one that was a little bit more comfortable for him. As his art was gaining popularity, his career would explode when being featured in the August issue of Life magazine in 1949. "Is he the greatest living painter in the United States?" asked Life magazine. His work at that time was identified as drip painting, earning him the nickname Jack the Dripper. Here's what Pollock had to say about his process.
I don't work from drawings or color sketches. My painting is direct. I feel more at home, more at ease in a big area. Having the canvas on the floor, I feel nearer, more a part of the painting. This way I can walk around it, work from all four sides, and be in the painting. Similar to the Indian sand painters of the West.
For most of the paint I use is a liquid flowing kind of paint. The brushes I use are more as sticks rather than as a brush. The brush doesn't touch the surface of the canvas. It's just above. It seems to be possible to control the flow of the paint to a great extent. And I don't use the accident, as I deny the accident.
He could fling a skein of paint with the accuracy of a cowboy with a lasso. And that cowboy business, I mean, I don't like to bring that in, the business of Jackson as a Western, and that's part of myth, convenient myth. But he did acquire marvelous control of that stick he would use to fling paint. And then he'd use a basting syringe. Big basting syringe. Well, basting syringes aren't big. And he had a lot more control than the myth would have. We had as much control as you need to make good art.
It was also around this time that he began to number his paintings, along with the year instead of giving them titles. Later in 1952, art critic Harold Rosenberg would identify Pollock as an action painter. The action was in the dripping and the artist's physical movements. There are also some cases where he mixed other materials into the paint, including glass. And here's what one of his neighbors had to say about his memory watching Jackson at work.
It was a little bit surprising when we first went in there. Here's this guy, he's bombed right out of his mind. And the canvas, is so-called painting, that's laying on the floor. And he had a card table with all these little jars of different color paint. So he's slopping around there barefoot in the paint, and he just takes the jars of paint and just throws them on the paint, and he staggers around there. And he's still walking in it, the wet paint, but some of the jars slipped out of his hand. And the broken glass, well, that sort of got mixed in too. And then his feet started to bleed, but it didn't seem to make any difference. He's still slopping around in the paint and the blood and the glass. And this thing was supposed to have been a painting when he's got done. But myself, after becoming a professional drunk on my own, then I could see where he was painting all of this stuff, the different thoughts that he had. But when you really get that drunk, your mind sort of does wander in circles, and I guess anything looks good at that point. And that was supposed to have been a great painting that he done. And I probably sold it for $1 million now. But at the time, I wouldn't give 10 cents for it, and I still wouldn't. This is, of course, my opinion of it.
When considering all of Jackson Pollock's numerous action paintings, the most famous is probably Lavender Mist. The work was painted on November the 1st, 1950, and is textured with more line complexity than any other Pollock work.
This kind of art isn't the kind of art that is meant to be flipped through quick as you're scrolling through your Instagram feed. This is art that you really have to take time to look at.
The energy demonstrated and the deep colors that bounce off of one another keep the viewer captivated. This is Pollock at his most sober and at his artistic prime.
Jackson Pollock made a lot of great works, but for my taste, I say Lavender Mist is probably my favorite. Or Moby Dick.
The photographer Hans Namus would make a very unique set of video images of Pollock painting, and this would be the pivot point toward the decline of Pollock. The last day of shooting was Thanksgiving Day, and it was bitter cold and very windy, and Pollock was agitated, came inside, and went directly to the kitchen sink and pulled out a bottle of whiskey. He poured himself a tumbler full of whiskey and began to drink. Everybody sits down at the table for a Thanksgiving meal, and he says, "Now?" In a shallow voice, Lee Krasner says, "Oh God, now what?" And a second time, Pollock says, "Now?" a little bit louder, and then with a roar grabbing the edge of the table, he yelled, "No!" Although he was the first American abstract painter to be taken seriously in Europe, he would continue to struggle with alcoholism and depression. No amount of success could help him with those issues. Toward the end of his life, he was not really painting at all. Professionally, he was really in a tough situation. His drip paintings were popular, but critics really wanted something new. It was during this time that he was being interviewed by Sheldon Rodman for a book titled Conversations with Artists. This was 8 weeks before his death. In an attempt to show some paintings to illustrate his ideas, he took Rodman and his wife out to his studio, but he lost the key. After a few minutes of looking for the key, the frustrated and drunk Pollock smashed the window with his fist, then smashing out 2 others with his elbow. They recalled him saying, "Wait, I'll get the hammer and really go to work on this." In the studio, his point was illustrated and Rodman went back to the house, leaving Pollock and his wife in the studio, where Pollock began to cry uncontrollably. Pointing at one of his paintings, he would say, "Do you think I would have painted this crap if I knew how to draw a hand?" On top of that, his marriage was in a really rough spot, with his alcohol abuse and taking on a mistress, Ruth Klingman. The two had met in March of '56 and dated a little while, but by June, Klingman had broken it off with him. But late in June, she got a job as the supervisor at an art school that was near East Hampton, and they began to see each other again.
Very often he would say to me, we'd be sitting around the kitchen table in the morning having our coffee, and he'd say, I'd love that attitude, very Western, there are only 3 artists, Picasso, Matisse, and Pollock. And then the other side, the flip side of that, he would say, I'm no good, I'm a phony.
This was also a unique time for Lee Krasner. She was beginning to really gain momentum with her career as an artist. Pollock and Krasner would have a huge fight on July the 9th. She gave Pollock an ultimatum. Either stop cheating or she was leaving, and he just told her to go. Krasner did leave for a trip to Europe on July the 12th. Krasner was gone, and Klingman was coming in. By August, Lee wanted to get word from Pollock that she could return home, and at this point, Klingman was sick of going to parties with Pollock, being ignored while he got drunk with his friends. So on August the 9th, Klingman went off to New York, where she met up with one of her friends, Edith Metzger, for lunch. Metzger was a 25-year-old receptionist. Klingman had convinced Metzger to come back to spend the weekend with her in Jackson. That night, Klingman had a date, but would return to the Springs accompanied by Metzger on the 7:05 train from New York the morning of August 11th. Pollock drank all day. After a steak dinner, they all went off for a party at Alfonso Osorio's house.
He kept stopping the car, crying.
On the way, he was stopped by a policeman that Jackson knew, and he went on his way. He was falling asleep and turned into a parking lot when Metzger jumped out. She was scared and didn't want to drive with the drunk Pollock anymore. Klingman convinced her to get in the car so they could all go home, and unfortunately she did. Jackson was a fast, aggressive, crazy driver, and he was drunk and angry and began to speed in a road rage. Metzger would scream and beg for him to stop the car, but the angry Pollock would floor the light green 1950 Oldsmobile 88 convertible. Fireplace Road had several curves, and Jackson was laughing wildly as Metzger screamed at the top of her lungs. As he slid around one more corner, he could not make the next one. The intoxicated Pollock drove his car into 2 small elm trees. Metzger and Pollock both died in the crash.
Him dying in an automobile accident became almost a James Dean, Camus kind of mythology. That helped the romance of the great artist, the romantic artist, not to live it out, to die too young before you become old hat.
That's the stupidest thing I've ever heard.
Pollock would be buried at Green River Cemetery in the Springs on August the 15th. No friends spoke at the funeral, mostly because of what he had done. A man that would work hard to become creative. A tormented man that struggled with his vices. A man that would make a life-destroying mistake. To this day, he has a huge influence on the world's art community.
They wanted what we all want. Fame and money.
Yes.
And girls, too, I suppose.
Yeah.
According to Freud. So. Really.
I love the story of Jackson Pollock.
No, that's really cool.